Today's episode of the How to Do Your 20s podcast, we're going to be talking about the paleo diet. We're going to be talking about entrepreneurship. We're going to be talking about a lot of really interesting things on how you can start a blog, grow a following, and really help a lot of people. And I'm extremely happy and excited to have Robb Wolf today on the show. So first off, Robb, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey man, huge honor to be here, and I don't know how applicable my insight is, given that I'm multiples of 20 at this point, but I'll provide what I can.
People always say that, but it's always better because if you get someone that's 21, they don't have a lot of insight. I'd rather have somebody that has done it and has seen a few other people do it as
Right,
well.
right. Okay, cool.
Let's dive into your story though. I mean, obviously, you're pretty well known within the paleo diet community now, but how did you get there?
Oh man, it's kind of a long, convoluted story, but I in my past life, I was a research biochemist, mainly in the areas of autoimmunity and cancer. Had a really significant health crisis. I had ulcerative colitis so bad that they wanted to perform a bowel resection on me at the age of 26, 27. And I was looking at medical school, looking at a potential PhD research track, kind of thinking about those options. And I knew enough about the outcomes of surgery on the intestinal tract that was a bad move. Like good things weren't going to come of that. I've always been interested in health and fitness. I was a California state powerlifting champion. But I mean, I was really, really sick. So right now I'm about 175 pounds. I do some old guy Brazilian jiu-jitsu. At the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was 130 pounds. So imagine 40 pounds less of me, basically existing. And this was just how inflamed and damaged my gut lining was. And I was tinkering with a high carb, low fat vegan diet, which for me, that just didn't work well. And there were a bunch of other factors. I wasn't sleeping enough. I was in my 20s. I thought I could, motor through. Sleep was for the weak. You sleep when you're dead. And so even though the dietary piece wasn't a good fit, there were lots and lots of other elements to the story that I also put in. So I don't want to throw that vegan approach under the bus unduly. There were a lot of different factors that went into it. But this idea of an ancestral health or paleo diet type template got on my radar. I started implementing that, and it's not an overstatement to say that it effectively saved my life. It was like throwing a life preserver to a drowning person. And it was so impactful on me that I really couldn't wrap my head around going to medical school, spending 8 years learning about pathology, only to then turn around and start talking about health or trying to talk about health. And it was right around this time, right around 2000, 2001, I was farting around on the internet looking for workout stuff, and I found this new thing called CrossFit. And my buddy and I started using the workouts. His name's Dave Warner. He's a retired Navy SEAL. And we started working out in his garage up in Seattle, and we really liked it. And before we knew it, we had about 15 or 20 people that we were training. And we decided that we needed to open a gym, and we wanted to call it CrossFit. And so we reached out to the Glassmans, the CrossFit founders. We said, hey, we love your stuff. We want to open a gym, want to call it CrossFit. Can we do that? And they said, yes, go be achieve. And so that was the first CrossFit affiliate. And then about a year later, I moved back down to Chico, California, and opened what was then the fourth CrossFit affiliate gym. And the opportunity to work in the gym and also for the larger CrossFit community was huge, because I was able to take all this theory behind this ancestral health, paleo diet, evolutionary medicine story and actually apply it to people. And I got a massive amount of feedback. I figured out what worked, what didn't. And, just kind of I guess they say the rest is history. I had a New York Times bestseller out of the first book. Our gym was picked as one of Men's Health top 30 gyms in America. And I mean, it's just a little 3,000 square foot gym, but we really achieved some jaw-dropping success with people, and not just this kind of run-of-the-mill like body composition transformation, which is really important, but we were working a lot with people who had autoimmune disease, traumatic brain injury. Like, we were doing a lot of really interesting stuff because of the background that I had. We were able to kind of tackle these things in a very different way than what the mainstream is doing.
So let's talk about that. So, I mean, you brushed over the fact that you have a best-selling book, but that is obviously a big deal. How were you able to take this knowledge and actually first before we go there, did the blog come first or did the book come first?
The blog came first. I started robwolf.com in 2006, and the blog was up and running. And I mean, in the early days when people were really following blogs in a legitimately serial fashion, day to day, I spent a lot of time, I mean, like 60, 80-hour weeks writing, and researching. And also at that point, there was just a lot fewer people in this space. And so you ended up garnering a lot of bandwidth with that. But the blog was up and running, and this is maybe an insight on the entrepreneurial side. If people are familiar with the E-Myth, the entrepreneurial myth book, I was that classic technician. I liked what I did, but we didn't have a thought about how or if to monetize the blog. The first thing that I ever had for sale via the blog, and this was in 2010, was the book itself. And then it wasn't until 2012 that my web gal was like, hey, we should probably have an email list. And I was like, email list? That sounds super like, late 90s. And she was like, no, that's actually who buys the bulk of your stuff. And this was one of the interesting things, even though I had the success of CrossFit was interesting because it provided both insights and hip fakes in equal amount. They did nothing the standard way. They did nothing out of the standard textbook of what you would normally do, like email lists and SEO optimization and stuff like that. And they absolutely crushed it. And it kind of the idea was if you just generate top-notch content, that's good enough, and then you'll figure out a way of monetizing your eyeballs. And that's just not true. Not for everybody. It's this once in a generation lightning striking kind of thing. And CrossFit was interesting in that they arrived, if that concept had been developed and tried to push to a broader market 10 years earlier, it would have never gone because the internet didn't really exist. It didn't exist in the format that it did in the early 2000s, in the ability to post pictures and then videos. And effectively what CrossFit.com did was blog before the word blog was even, really formalized. And so they had this serial posting, daily posting of the workout of the day, and also a lot of, support material around nutrition and other strength and conditioning concepts. So it's interesting because I missed a lot of opportunity because I was not thinking about this in a sophisticated way, right from the beginning. And so we've seen other people enter this space that had a good marketing background, that really understood this stuff. They oftentimes also had their own personal transformation story. So they were incredibly passionate about this topic. It wasn't like there was just some sort of greasy, nefarious process of wanting to profiteer, but they were way more effective at implementing, some sort of a monetized system. And then interestingly, they were able to reach a lot of people in a pretty rapid fashion.
So what do those people do different from what you did? You said they have a marketing background, but what are the specific things that really stood out
Oh
to you?
man, I mean, so when I did have I'd finally get a email sign up thing for my blog, you needed to be a private investigator to find it. Like it was almost a Mensa IQ test to even find where it was, And so instead of having a pop-up that would invite people to do this, instead of having some free downloadable guides, and all good value add stuff, but having a premium feature mixed in with a freemium feature, I just these are the things that these folks are doing. Some people pretty early on were doing like some A/B testing and stuff like that, so that they could get a little bit of granularity about what people were responding to. They would tweak some wording, tweak some colors and whatnot. But most people weren't doing anything like that, up until maybe 2013, and then some of the old guard, more established people started getting savvier to what they needed to do with that.
So in the early days of your blog, was there ever like days that you had a really big uptick in visitors? And if so, what happened on those days?
I have to think about that. I mean, okay, I did one blog post called Framework Matters, which was about evolutionary medicine and kind of arguing that this evolutionary template is really critical to understanding the world and critical to understanding medicine. And it was a super contentious, hot topic because there are a lot of people in the world that think evolution is bunk. They put it out there with, UFOs and flying saucers, and they think that the Earth is 6,000 years old, and it gets super contentious. And so it was one of these, early examples. We see it every day, every moment on things like Facebook and Twitter. Like there's not a single statement made without somebody throwing their hands up in the air and being frustrated. But, this was definitely one of those things. I don't know that it necessarily trended anywhere, but there were over 1,000 comments. This was before you could really track, like Facebook shares and everything. There was nothing sophisticated like that. But I forget what the blog traffic was, but the general blog traffic was maybe like 1 million, 1.5 million unique hits a month to the website. And I think we ended up getting about 750,000 unique hits to that blog post alone within about a 10-day period. So that was one of the early, really large kind of splashes it was made. And this was before even being particularly sophisticated with like meta tags or getting in and doing like some Google keyword searching about like, okay, what are people looking for? I just said framework matters. I mean, it couldn't have been a more oblique term for SEO optimization than you could possibly imagine. But it's still, because of the qualitative nature of the post, it really is quite impactful, and it still is one of these things that garners a lot of traffic. Like there's still a lot of people that get in and read that and still comment on it occasionally.
And is it so? The success of that post was just people sharing it on Facebook, or it was just the sticky nature of the post itself?
I want to say that Facebook existed, but it wasn't. This was a time before, the social media shares really being the primary driver. It was more of a people, I suspect, emailing it back and forth, doing some reposts on their own blogs and stuff like that. So it was kind of before the social media element of this really, really came on, or at least before I really got plugged into that. Yeah.
So, and at this point, you even had, you said, I think, like 1.5 million unique visitors a month. That's still a huge amount. So even before that, was it just that I mean, obviously it wasn't just, but a big part of it, the fact that you were one of the few people doing this and you were writing quality content, or was there some secrets behind the scene?
Nope. That Johnny on the spot, like a right place, right time, and doing some really good value added content. Yeah.
And at this time, so you were just, I guess, how long ago did the podcast come out?
The podcast was launched on the heels of the book launch, which was 2010.
Okay.
Yeah.
And for the actual book launch, what did the marketing look like for that? Because that was obviously a huge success.
Yeah. It was interesting because prior to the reason why the book happened at all, I had been on the road doing an 8-hour seminar. Basically, the material that's in that Paleo Solution book was largely what I covered. And I had a guide that I kept refining and updating, and I had material that I wanted people to read before arriving at the event so that I could cover more ground more quickly, have fewer questions, and kind of cover all this stuff on the front end. And so this guide just kept getting bigger and bigger. And then a good friend of mine, Glenn Cordoza, who is a kind of retired MMA fighter, he co-authored a ton of MMA instructionals with people like Eddie Bravo, Randy Couture. I mean, he ended up co-authoring Kelly Starrett's books also, the Supple Leopard and some other pieces. But he was attached with this publisher called Victory Belt, which had basically focused on martial arts instructional books. And he and I were chatting, and he was like, so, this guide you're writing, would you ever think about making a book out of it? And I was like, yeah, maybe we could self-publish it or something. And he asked me what type of website traffic I had. And I told him, he's like, to get a New York Times bestseller, you only, and I put only in quotations here, you only need to sell somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 copies in a week to be able to make the New York Times bestseller list. Now, when you say that, 99.9% of books never sell more than 10,000 copies. So, I mean, it's and this is in the lifetime of their existence. So, I mean, it's a pretty rarefied deal. But I looked at that and I was like, man, okay, we've got, 1 million, 1.5 million unique viewers on the blog. If I had some tiny fractional conversion of that into purchases, then we could probably do pretty well. And so we we started working on the book, and I did it through Victory Belt, which was kind of cool because they really gave me carte blanche on what I wanted to do. They offered some suggestions about where to go, but they allowed me to keep my voice. I was a student of Lauren Cordain's, the guy who wrote the original Paleo Diet book, and I was sitting in his office when he received the initial corrected manuscript that his publisher put back to him, and the guy almost cried. I mean, they changed that book in ways that are still pretty disturbing, and I just didn't want to experience something like that. So I opted for going for a small, relatively unknown publisher and having I wanted full control over the whole thing. And if it was going to bomb, I wanted it to bomb because I sucked, not because the publishers destroyed it. And if it was going to be successful, I wanted it to be due to my merits. And we did a decent amount of, just blog posts, or I got on a few podcasts early on. Some people like Ben Greenfield, Carl Lenore doing Superhuman Radio. There were some people doing some early podcasts there, but there weren't really that many compared to what there is now. And I'm reasonably good friends with Tim Ferriss, and he agreed to host one of the chapters of my book on his blog during the release week. And so we had some really good synergy come in with that. And so we made the New York Times list with that first book.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then obviously you have your new book. So how is the new book different from your original book?
Oh man, it's hugely different, even though there's still a lot of this paleo evolutionary medicine thing in it. But where the first book really started the whole conversation from, hey, our Paleolithic ancestors lived like this, had these health characteristics, maybe it would be worthwhile to emulate some of this stuff. The Wired to Eat really focuses on the neuroregulation of appetite. And the neuroregulation of appetite is really the key to eating enough so that you support your physicality and activity, but not so much that you overeat and get sick. And there's a lot of different factors that play into that: sleep, stress, exercise levels, the type of food that we're exposed to. And it's all completely driven by this evolutionary medicine process. This is where our genetics were forged. But instead of starting at that specifically paleo diet spot, I start this whole conversation from the neuroregulation of appetite. And I really make the case that in this modern world that we live in, you can't be surprised if it's really, really hard to avoid eating, everything in the snack aisle of the supermarket. That's some good evolutionary wiring to want to eat everything and then rest. And so we kind of start from that. And what's interesting about that is the intent and the feedback has been that it really removes all the emotionality and the guilt around this process of changing diet and lifestyle. There's a huge sense of failure on the part of people trying to enact change because it's hard, and they feel like there's something wrong with them, that this should just be easy. And for some people, it is relatively easy to make these changes. For a lot of people, it's not. And the thing that really hamstrings them, though, is when they start getting into kind of a self-defeating mental state where they're like, I'm a failure, I'm just weak, I'm just going to give up and abandon this whole thing. And so the book does a really good job of setting a tone so that you can forgive yourself for this whole situation. The working title of the book was "It's Not Your Fault," and we ended up opting for Wired to Eat. But the first chapter in the book is called "It's Not Your Fault," and the feedback's been pretty powerful. Like I've done a limited number of book signings, but some folks who had already read the book, who had longstanding eating disorders, challenges with food. Breakdown, crying, hugs, thank yous. Really powerful stuff. So, it's very different in that way. And it's also different in that, although I've always encouraged people to start with this paleo template and then to experiment and kind of, look beyond just that kind of framework, in this book, I really provide a step-by-step process for people to actually implement that. And part of that is what's called a 7-day carb test. And so I help people reestablish a good baseline of the neuroregulation of appetite. And then we get in and pick a battery of different carbohydrate sources. We eat those in the morning. We wait for 2 hours, check our blood glucose response. If the blood glucose is below a certain level, then that's probably a good option for people. If it's above a certain level, then I usually recommend that they opt for something else or reducing the portion amount. And this is an outgrowth of some research that came out of the Weizmann Institute in Israel that came out about 2.5 years ago. And the takeaway from that was that they started feeding people a battery of different types of meals and carbohydrate amounts and ratios. And the blood glucose responses were all over the map. Like there was nothing consistent about this stuff. Some people did great with rice. Other people did terribly with rice. One of the foods that was really confounding, about 50% of people had a great blood glucose response from hummus, like the chickpea, dip deal. And about 50% of people had a terrible blood glucose response from it. And even though I'm the paleo guy and theoretically legumes are bad, I would look at chickpeas as a biochemist and say it's mainly protein and fiber. The carbohydrate content is almost non-existent, but yet people were getting really profound blood glucose responses. And what appeared to be happening is that they had an immunogenic response. It wasn't an allergy. It wasn't quite a food sensitivity, but it was irritating to their system, and it caused a stress response. That stress response would cause the adrenals to release cortisol. Cortisol releases glucose out of the liver. And so even though you could be eating a relatively low carbohydrate food, you can get a very elevated blood glucose level because of the stress response. But the whole takeaway from all this is that you just can't do a one-size-fits-all recommendation for people. Like as nice as that would be, it's like, hey, do this, and then I can hang a gone fishing sign on my website and move to Nicaragua and have a coconut farm and be done. But there's a reality that there's a massive amount of individual variation, and that variation can change over time. If you have somebody that is normally carb tolerant, and then they go into a shift work scenario, like we see this in police, military, and fire all the time. The person's been on day shift, they're carb tolerant, they're a CrossFit athlete, they're crushing stuff. Then they go to night shift, and all of a sudden they're getting fat around the midsection. They don't seem to tolerate carbs, and it's because they've altered their circadian rhythm and sleep. So there's just a lot of different factors there. But the cool thing is that so long as we're willing to do a little bit of both subjective and objective testing, the subjective piece is just paying attention to how we feel between meals and really what our cognitive function is like, mental clarity. And then if we can couple that with a little bit of, just quantification, doing some blood glucose monitoring, we can dial things in for our best effect. And so it's a pretty powerful process.
What kind of testing have you done with yourself that's been surprising, if there's been anything?
So my wife and I both did some blood glucose testing, and it was interesting because I've just empirically, like observationally noticed, I don't do that well with a ton of carbs, like white rice, white potatoes. If I have a really blistering hard workout, I can eat a fair amount of that post-workout, and it doesn't seem to affect me too much. But if I eat a lot of them consistently, I get blood sugar swings, I get hungry between meals, I start getting chubby around the midsection. But I did some blood glucose testing and ate this battery of meals, basically did this 7-day carb test. And then my wife did it as well. And again, kind of observationally, we've always known that or suspected that she could eat more carbs than I could and seem to do well. Like we would have some Mexican food and, I would ask her, did you feel bad after that? And she's like, yeah, for like 20 minutes. And for me, I would be sick for like 3 days, like just foggy headed, GI problems. And what was interesting is she ate the exact same amounts and types of carbs that I did, and she was consistently like a 50 to 60% better blood glucose response than what I had. When I ate white rice and white potatoes, my blood glucose would get 165, 180 at that 2-hour mark, which is really high. And for my wife, she would be like 118 or 120. And she's 30, 35 pounds lighter than I am. So just from a dilution standpoint, you would expect that the blood glucose could have been higher, in her. But her insulin sensitivity, the way that she deals with that blood glucose response is profoundly better than what mine is. And we just did a little bit of a follow-up on that where she fasted for 1 day. And she went a dinner to dinner fast. And this was just super interesting, because one of the gauges of whether or not you get all this stuff right is you should be able to, at the drop of a hat, go 8, 10, 12, 20 hours without eating. And although you might be hungry, you would still be functional. You wouldn't completely auger into a mountainside and become incapable of thinking and whatnot. And what that indicates is you're metabolically flexible. You can use carbohydrate, you can use fat, You can shift into ketosis relatively easily. And ketosis is a state where we convert fat molecules into these ketone bodies, which can fuel the brain in a pretty effective way. And my wife, she did that dinner to dinner fast. And at the 24-hour mark, she had a blood glucose of 71 milligrams per deciliter, which is low but good. And her blood ketone level was a 0.8, which is basically in nutritional ketosis. And it took her basically 1 day to get into this. And although she was hungry, she worked out that day. She walked our dog. We have 2 kids. She was completely functional that whole time. And so this was a pretty good illustration that she's very metabolically healthy, very metabolically flexible. And now for myself, for me to be able to be in that state where I could go 8, 10, 12 hours, 24 hours without eating, I have to just already be eating lower carb, maybe about 75, a max of 100 grams of carbs a day. And then I still have that metabolic flexibility, but I'm still less flexible on the carb fed side than what my wife is. And then I would still also argue that she shifts into that ketosis and fat burning easier. And that's because she's more insulin sensitive and probably has some healthier mitochondria, healthier gut, and a bunch of other features.
And what have you found now? Like, what is your daily meals that work for you? Do you do the intermittent fasting, anything like that?
I do a bit of intermittent fasting, although I've played with that. A good friend of mine, Bill Lagakos, he's a professor of biochemistry and circadian rhythms. And so that intermittent fasting story is usually something like a dinner to dinner fast, or maybe you make dinner happen at 5 p.m. and then you don't eat it the following day until noon or something like that. And something that Bill has pointed out is that we're more insulin sensitive earlier in the day, and we there's some good anchoring of the circadian rhythm, like our light dark cycling. And so he's made the argument it would be better to eat more of our calories, particularly more of our carbs, earlier in the day. And then if you were to jettison a meal or make a meal much smaller, it would be dinner. And so even though lifestyle wise, it's much easier to get up, have a cup of coffee and, skip breakfast or push breakfast to later in the day, I've been playing with eating a lot more food earlier in the day and then having no or little meal in the evening. And I have 2 kids and dinner is kind of like the meal to spend together. And so I usually don't skip it entirely, but it might just be like a little bit of protein and like some greens or something like that. So it's a very small meal, and I'm doing much more of my feeding earlier in the day, particularly the post-workout period. Like if I do a interval session, a hard jiu-jitsu session or something like that, I stick more of the calories around that period. And for me, that's been working pretty darn well. I know some people do quite well with that, skip breakfast or push breakfast to later in the day. I tend to be kind of a type A, high-strung person, and that breakfast in the morning seems to ground me a little bit, and that seems to be good for my overall energy throughout the rest of the day.
Oh, I agree. I need to eat at least a little bit of something for breakfast. Otherwise, I feel a little too, I don't know, too energetic almost. Like I need a little bit of a calm.
Yeah. Because fasting is a bit of a stress, and it can be a good stress. So it's called a eustress. But if you're already kind of high strung and then you want to drink a little coffee and stuff like that, like you can really easily get yourself in the deep end of the stimulant pool. And so that's been also another boon, is that when I eat that food, because it kind of settles me, I'm able to drink a little more coffee and not have it make me totally jittery and crazy. So I consider that kind of a win.
So let's talk a little bit more about your whole routine, because you're obviously pretty successful, and I'd just be interested to kind of dig in. So what does your morning routine look like, for instance?
Oh man, I listen to Tim Ferriss a lot, and I know he asked that question of people, and so many people are so buttoned up on that, and I feel like an absolute idiot. But part of the deal is having young kids. But I have 2 daughters that will, within a month, will be 3 and 5. And the morning is really hard to get a routine because you don't know exactly when they are going to wake up. You don't know if somebody has poop from their earlobes to their toenails, because they blew their diaper out. So I'll kind of flip this around. Like the place that I've found the most benefit on routine is my evening ritual, actually, because the launching the rocket in the morning is like, it's chaos. It's like a demilitarized zone, third world country. Like you don't know what you're facing. But the evenings we do dinner. We usually do a bath. We do story. We read stories. As the sun sets, we put dimmer switches in our throughout our whole house, and we put in these LED lights that are kind of in the orange spectrum already. And so it pulls some of the blue spectrum of light out, but we dial that down. We put on some blue blockers. And so we have a really dedicated go to bed, kind of process. And it's really good for the girls. Like they are like clockwork going to bed. They go down super easily. And for my wife and I, we tend to go to bed pretty early. And the girls, can wake up reasonably early. But I've found that out of anything that I do, if I really pay particular attention to that go to bed process and kind of honor that circadian rhythm in the evening and not, being on iPhones, iPads, computers, not having a ton of light in my eyes, man, my sleep is so much better. My recovery is better. And if that gets compromised, like I notice when I travel, despite my best efforts, it's just not as dialed in, and my recovery isn't as good the next day. I'm an hour or two short slept. The sleep quality isn't quite as good. And so even though I've been unable to really effectively pin down like a morning routine because I have so much chaos there, the evening routine has been huge. And that is the thing that I've been able to have great control over. And the benefit to me is just remarkable.
One thing I feel like I also listen to and love Tim Ferriss's work, but one thing I feel like he skips over a lot is the daytime, like actually the workday routine. Do you have more of a set workday routine, or how do you go about figuring out what you're going to do?
Yeah, and that's a really good question because again, back to that E-Myth kind of story, I have not tackled this in a really systematic fashion until maybe the last 2 years, where I really started thinking about what I'm doing as a business and not, wanting to both increase revenue, increase the money that I'm making, but also increase the reach and the impact that I have. And my wife has actually been huge in that. She's basically become a project manager and has helped me to triage what I need to do. And so I've got this new book that came out, Wired to Eat, and it's basically been about a year and a half to 2 years of writing, editing, marketing, and promotion. Like it's all been focused around that. And so we've had to really do a good job of triaging and prioritizing what needs to get done today. What do we kick to the next day? What things look like, fires that need to be put out, but actually can be completely ignored. And so that's been one of the greatest challenges that I face because I'm a pretty random access person. I'm not super linear. I'm not inherently super organized. And so it's a challenge for me to really sit down and delineate what's the thing that I need to do today. And my wife was a co-founder of a technology company, and she was in that for about 5 years, ended up checking out of that. And she's really good with companies, taking them from the swamp to the dirt road. But once you get an HR department and you can't like send people at work like, dirty jokes and stuff like that, she's just like, okay, I'm done. So she retired out of that scene and started helping me with my work. And so she really does a great job of running point and figuring out, okay, these are the things that we're going to do today. And I tell you something that we just started doing about a month ago is one day a week on typically Thursdays, but you had already signed up, so you snuck in on this. But Thursdays are now our business development day. So instead of working in the business, we work on the business. And part of that is we'll go to a coffee shop one day, we'll go to a spa and get a massage and a sauna or whatever, but some restoration stuff. And then we've got pads and paper and erase boards, and we just brainstorm and make ideas. We use a project management platform called Trello, and we will take that stuff from kind of pad and paper and get it into Trello and start kind of almost storyboarding the things that we need to do. And I have a really good friend, Dave Dooley, who's a business mentor, and he has a great saying, first things first, second things never. And so we're trying to get better at delineating what is that first thing first. But my wife is quite good at helping me to ferret that stuff out. She's quite creative too, but my strength is more on the content generation and creativity side. She is a great interface on the creativity ideas, but also getting some focus on what is the next most important thing that we need to tackle so that we can move the whole project forward.
Do you have any advice for any of us 20 somethings out here that don't have, let's say, a wife or a partner that's able to really kind of ground us down? Because obviously you've had the blog for a little while and you've gotten some success. Any advice on how to really figure out day to day what you should be doing?
Man. It's tough, without knowing the specific situation. But I think always, it's similar to when somebody asks me, how do I lose weight, or how do I put 50 pounds on my back squat or something like that? Who are you? What are your circumstances? And what do you want to do? And so, with that blog or the online business, the solopreneurship that you mentioned, I think being really crystal clear about where are you currently. And this could even be something that you do, you do the dry erase paint in your office, or, you get some dry erase boards in there and you write down, here's where I am. And it's like health, wellness, financial status, relationship stuff. Like you have a whole catalog of that so that you've got a picture of where you exist in space and time. Like this is kind of, a rundown of where you are. And then what do you want to do? What is that goal? Like, do you have a goal of a 6 or 7 figure income per year off of your blog? Okay, great. Here's where you are. Here's what you want to do. Now, what are the steps in between that we need to do to try to affect that whole process? And so I always think about things in kind of the terminology or analogy of a map. And part of a map is, where you are, where you want to go, you've got your destination, and then we can start figuring out the route from there. So I would really encourage some thinking about where your current situation is, and then some really valid or accurate goals. And maybe you've got a long-term goal also, maybe it's a 6-figure goal. Well, maybe at 3 months you could have a 4-figure goal of income off the blog. And so you've got some incremental goalposts there. Having too long of a timeline can be really detrimental for people. This makes me think of a Tony Robbins quote, and I'm going to butcher the timeline on this, but it's something to the effect: people grossly overestimate what they can do in a year and dramatically underestimate what they can do in a decade. And so, like if I could have a conversation with my 20-something self, it's that those 10 years are going to go by shockingly fast. I mean, stunningly fast. And if you have a goal, and even though that goal may seem like it's going to take an awful long time, that time is going to click by no matter what. And if you figure out some way to both have a good, an enjoyable life, it can't all be 100% about work. So you figure out some degree of work-life balance, but then also just keep an eye on the prize and figure out some intermediate steps to get you to that longer goal point. It'll be interesting because, man, the time just blasts by, and you kind of have a choice of having knocked off some accomplishments along the line, or just spinning and not really getting anywhere in that process. But the time is going to go by remarkably quickly either way that you do it.
You've talked about the E-Myth a few times. Do you have, what are some of the top books you'd recommend either to the audience or some of your favorite books?
Oh man. Business wise. So,
I'll open it up. It doesn't even have to just be business wise. It can be just things that have really impacted you that you think others should also read.
Let me throw this out there. To the degree I've been successful, I orient my worldview with a couple of different kind of frameworks. Thermodynamics, it's basically energy flow. How much energy goes into a system, how much energy goes out of a system. If somebody comes to you and says, hey, I want you to invest money in a bioethanol farm. Basically, they raise corn, they turn the corn into ethanol, and then that's going to run cars. Is that a good idea or a bad idea? For me, the first question I would ask with that is, well, do you get more energy out of the process than what you put into it? In that situation, the answer is no. And there's a ton of processes, political topics like climate change and all these different things, that there's a lot of gnashing of teeth. And the gnashing of teeth is mainly because people do not think a moment about the energy that goes into doing something relative to what we get out of it. And, like in the technology scene, there's all this kind of fanfare about like vertical farming, taking old warehouses and putting fluorescent lights over lettuce and growing lettuce. And this is supposed to be a wonderful thing. And when you really look at the energetics of that versus growing grass and feeding cattle and getting food out of a biodynamic kind of system like that, it doesn't really pencil out that well. So there's the pitch that I'm going to make is that if people have a really fundamental, and I mean, this can be super 101 level, you could look at YouTube videos about evolutionary biology, basic economics, and thermodynamics. And if you just have a non-mathematical but a conceptual understanding of those basic features, you will profoundly understand the world in a way that people without that steeping a huge cross-section of their reality is effectively magic. They have literally no idea why the things in the world work the way that they work. And for me, it's been a huge comparative advantage in making investment decisions, in being able to vet out businesses and different ideas. I had somebody approach me about an idea of this process of capturing waste heat off of refrigeration units and that being used to generate energy for some other processes. And the idea was great, but the time isn't quite right because there needs to be some tweaks in the energy distribution models for this thing to work. But I'm not an engineer. I'm a biochemist by training, so I do have a little more geek background, but I was even able to just ask the right questions to be able to find people to answer these things for me. And so, it could really help people vet out business opportunities. If you're at all concerned about health issues or environmental issues, if you don't have some of these basic steepings, then it's going to be really hard to make an informed decision. It's going to be more like magic than anything else.
So the last question I want to ask, and I ask all my guests before we wrap up this conversation is, do you have any general, and it doesn't have to be about business, but any general advice for all us still people in our 20s, all the 20-somethings out there that might help lead us to live a better life?
Man.
It's a big one.
Yeah, I'm thinking back. Sleep more. Like I honestly, and it sounds trite, but anything that you want to do, if you are better rested, you're going to be more on point. And the what's that saying? Youth is wasted on the young. And possibly the greatest element of youth is that although you can get by on sleep deprivation, you are so much more effective when well rested. And so I would really encourage people to a lot of times people will say, I'm not really willing to make dietary changes, or I'm not going to exercise, or I'm not going to change my exercise, or what have you. But they do want to have one thing that could dramatically improve their life and their productivity and whatnot. And putting more focus on sleep and restoration and kind of downtime. Whatever your ups are, you need an equal amount of time on the downside. And you either program that in, or biology wallops you over the head with it, with an illness, an injury, or something like that. So yeah, if I could do a collective humping of knees, it would be to basically take that sleep and restoration story much more seriously.
Awesome. That's great advice. Robb, where can people find out more about you and everything that you're doing?
Everything is at robbwolf.com. You can track me down. Most of the social media stuff I'm doing is on Instagram these days, and that is at @DasRobbWolf over at Instagram. But yeah, I answer as many of the questions as I possibly can over there, and always glad to help folks.
Robb, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Huge honor to be on the show. Thank you.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. And if you did, make sure you hit the big red subscribe button down below. You can also check me out on Facebook and on Twitter. And I release a new video every Monday. And by hitting that subscribe button, you'll get those new videos every Monday. And this is really a podcast. It's also a website. You can check out the website. It's howtodoyour20s.com. I'll put a link right over here as well. And what it's all about is trying to improve your life. And we specifically focus on things that people in their 20s are interested in. So make sure you like the video if you liked it, subscribe, like us on Facebook and Twitter, whatever. But I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you again on another video.